A house in heaven. It was a lousy summer, hot, without water, without electricity. There was war, fear, and darkness. Confused, baffled, and restless, like someone thrown into the depths of a chaotic dream, he grabbed the hands of his wife and kids and hastily left the country without thinking, without knowing what kind of future awaited him. He didn't want to be wise and cautious and far-sighted. He didn't want to consult with anyone, with those more experienced than him, those who were scared of any displacement and change, or believed in the soil, tradition and roots, whose staying was based on a moral decision. Masood hated the war and was scared of death. Nocturnal worries had drained him of all strength and patience, and a painful early morning anxiety kept disturbing him. He had to leave, he had to escape and reside somewhere safe, somewhere far away from bustle and bombs and explosions, far away from the possibility of death. He prepared everything furtively and in a flash. He sold his belongings and his house for peanuts to the first customer. He obtained a visa and packed his luggage. It was just before leaving that, like a man with a fever, his eyes fell on his mother and his knees faltered. He asked himself what would happen to her. Out of pain and desperation, his bowels twisted so terribly that for a moment he forgot about the war and death and decided to stay. Mahin Banu had all this time looked at him without questioning, objecting or commenting. She had seen her belongings go on sale and hadn't said a thing. She had seen strangers wandering in her house and hadn't spoken. She had kept sitting by the wall in a corner on the large Tabriz carpet, a relic of her ancestors, pitifully running her hand over its velvet flowers and gold-colored figures, a residue of bygone days. The last touch of her fingertips on that old familiar object was like touching a lukewarm body in its last moments of life. And she had grabbed the tassels of the tablecloth to hold it for a moment. Her eyes had run after ceramic bowls with flower and bird motifs that were being passed by hands, and after the high-base Russian table lamps that had been sold. She had wanted to say, "No, I won't let go of my cashmere bundles and my wedding mirror," or to take one of those things and hide it away, but she hadn't said anything. She had kept sitting in a corner, quiet and invisible, full of wounds inside, witnessing the departure of the clock and the table and chairs and china plates and golden frames, like the sad journey of the children of an elderly mother to alien towns. She had realized that hard times awaited her and accepted it. She didn't have any complaints about her son. She had transferred her house deeds to him several years ago. They had agreed not to sell the house before her death, but it was an old pact belonging to those times before the revolution and the war, before fear and trembling and the vagrancy of the kids. And Mahin Banu didn't want anything but the well-being and happiness of her son or daughter, who had married an Englishman and didn't live in Tehran. For their sake she would give away and had given away the carpet she sat on or her life, which was running out and nobody wanted. Her children were in love with her too, and Masood would have never thought of leaving her elderly mother and running away or taking care of his own business while she was stranded, homeless and needy. However, amid the apprehension and chaos, amid the war and bombardments and the possibility of death, he had lost his mind. He was no longer responsible for his deeds and demands. This Mahin Banu understood, and her silence, resignation and consent were born out of this motherly understanding. Of course she had cried a lot, furtively and away from others' eyes, in the night, in the dark and under the sheets, or in the day in the bathroom or behind the house's tall pine trees. She loved the cashmere carpets and old objects, legacies of her father and husband and the good old days of her youth. She had grown old with them and they had an age-old bond. Her memories wandered in the rooms like thousands of images scattered in the air, and the footprints and fingerprints of her childhood remained on the cobblestones of the courtyard and the bricks of the wall. Other than this house, she had no place of her own, and now she could see that she no longer owned this place or any other. Her feet rested on nothingness and she was suspended in the air. She wished she could duck her head and go away and disappear like ailing or dying cats do. But she could see that she was lively and alive and not yet ready to die. Others imposed an elderliness on her. Their ruthless glances and unfair judgments determined her age and hit her in the face with the passage of years. She had a young vision of herself, an image reflected in old mirrors, in the happy memories of bygone days. Her heart beat fast and her eyes ran after things. She was awaiting the future, she was waiting for spring and summer. She had 1,000 dreams for herself and her kids, grandchildren and grandchildren. 74, 76 or more. These were calculations other people made, those who tried to estimate the dates of his marriage and birth. Mahin Banu had not passed the 40th mark. This only she knew and felt and believed. And now, without a status and a place, she didn't know at which moment she had fallen. Who was she, where was she, and what should she do? She had become something of a wasteland, out of the cosmic order of systems, like a fallen star, exiled to the disturbed isolation of the heavens. She wished that she had not been and had not become. Death was at a distance from her. Her feet longed for the earth. Her body grasped the particles of light and warmth, and her thoughts, with 1,000 invisible strings, were tied to the corners and margins of a sweet life. It was decided that Mahin Banu would stay with her sister for several weeks or more, maybe even 2 or 3 months, until Masood D settled in Paris, rented a house and found a job, put his life in order, and then at the proper time and with peace of mind and a happy heart sent for his mother. Her daughter was also thinking of her. Despite her low income and high living costs, she frequently called from London and invited her. Her English son-in-law was a kind man too, and he was ready to accommodate his mother-in-law. However, they had to wait. Everything would finally be all right, better than before. Mahin Banu was patient and wise, and her kids were indebted to her inherent intelligence. The first 2 weeks passed a little tricky. Moving houses was complex, and Mahin Banu was not accustomed to sleeping in other people's homes. She was addicted to her room and bed and pillow, addicted to the sounds coming from the alley and the coming and going of her old neighbors, even addicted to the kitchen's stale smell and the familiar moisture of the upper floor staircase, and of course to the scent of the ivy outside her window, and the eternal presence of those 4 tall poplars the same age as his father. Her sister was kind and hospitable, and her husband, Dr. Yunus Khan, didn't bother anyone. He was a depressed, lonely man and was sorrowful of his children being away from him. All his 7 children had left Iran after the revolution. His elder son was a resident of Australia. It was impossible to get in touch with him. His 2 daughters, his beloved twins, were in America. The middle son wandered between Singapore, Thailand and Japan, and the youngest constantly changed his base. And one of the daughters, Dr. Yunus Khan thought, he wasn't sure, his memory didn't function, had become a citizen of Canada or India or an unknown country. The 2 sisters were close to each other, and Masood was not worried about them. His conscience was at rest. He knew that his mother was comfortable, and that was true. Nevertheless, the nocturnal bombardments and subsequently the downpour of damned missiles had made a significant change in Dr. Yunus Khan's quiet temper. He had become obsessed with bizarre thoughts, and he unreasonably suspected everyone. He eavesdropped from behind closed doors. He searched his wife's handbag or his sister-in-law's suitcase. He hid away his worthless junk collection and forgot where he had put things. He was sure that Mahin Banu had taken his glasses and lighter. He told this to his wife, and she protested, and the couple quarreled. Mahin Banu crouched behind the door and, shrunken with shame, contorted and kept counting the days. She wanted to go abroad as soon as possible to settle down with her kids. At the same time, she pitied Dr. Yunus Khan, knowing that his deeds were not intended or committed out of nastiness. Even the day when her finger was stuck in the door and her fingernail was torn out, or the night when her brother-in-law disturbed her bed and searched her pockets for his agate ring, she neither moaned nor objected nor complained. She told herself that all those moments would pass. She thanked God that her kids were healthy and that she was alive and alert. Finally, it was the promised day. Mahin Banu thought she was dreaming. Tears flowed down her face out of utmost happiness. She hardly cried before others. She couldn't help it. She kept kissing her grandchildren all over and didn't want to take a rest or go to bed. However, she had been up all night, at the airport, customs, searching for her suitcases, the loss of her handbag, forgetting to take her glasses and medications, the pain in her legs, the sudden dizziness and that damn nausea in the aeroplane. Notwithstanding all that, if she had been left to herself, she would have liked to spend the whole day talking and kissing her grandchildren and son and daughter-in-law, to walk in that mousehole of a flat, and excited and agitated ask them 1,000 irrelevant questions. For the first 2 nights, with much insistence and force, they had Mahin Banu sleep in the children's room. They spread a mattress in the living room for the kids, whispering secretly in their ears that grandmother had just arrived and was exhausted. Pity on her. They would later change her place and the kids could have their room back. Mahin Banu was sad to see the children's dissatisfied silence and their frowning. She wanted to say something, but she was too embarrassed. And she didn't have the strength, her whole body was tired. She fell asleep as soon as she laid her head on the pillow. She fainted, but near dawn she woke up with a start. She felt as though a weight of iron was on her chest, and an intruding unknown feeling, a kind of shame and humiliation and guilt circulated in her body. She remembered the upset look on her grandchildren's faces, and the thought that she had usurped their room agitated and disturbed her. It was as though someone poked her, as if needles had been planted inside her mattress and pillow. She would rather have slept behind the door in the corridor or squatted in the corner of a chair by the wall than occupy someone else's place. On the 3rd day they changed her place, and Mahin Banu could breathe in relief. They gave her a lightweight foam mattress. At night, she spread it in the living room and during the day hid it under the sofa. She had put her suitcases in the kitchen corner and dragged her handbag around wherever she went. The doors of the wardrobes would not be closed for the swelling of clothes, and there were heaps of stuff under the chairs. There was no room to move about. Mahin Banu had lived in a large house for a lifetime, with sunlit rooms, a view of the sky and the sun, and a garden and flower beds. Her room had wardrobes and chests, hundreds of trunks could be placed in the storage room upstairs, and a truckload of stuff in the cellar. Well, this episode belonged to the past. Life had ups and downs, and to sleep in the corner of the living room wasn't altogether without fun. Well, there was much noise down in the alley, and the underground train which passed near there shook the windows. However, from the first moment, Mahin Banu told herself that life abroad was like that. There was no reason to nag. She thanked God that she was with her kids and that her life was restored. Her grandchildren were happy with their life. They liked their school and had made friends with a handful of Arab and Portuguese classmates. Now and then there was a party and Mahin Banu had to change her place. She picked up her bedding and looked for a quiet corner. Where? There were 2 bedrooms, a narrow longish kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and a lavatory at its corner. Sleeping in the couple's bedroom was impossible, although her son had insisted, and her kind daughter-in-law had no objection. There was no space in the kids' bedroom, 2 beds attached, a handful of books and shoes, tennis rackets and a football on the floor. It only left the kitchen. She had no complaints. How much room would Mahin Banu occupy? She was the size of a kid, lean, delicate and frail. She could fit into the pantry or under the bed. A couple of nights, she had slept in the bathtub and managed to go to sleep. But her son abruptly protested and forced her mother to sleep in his bed next to his wife. It was the worst night in Mahin Banu's life. She was so ashamed in front of her daughter-in-law. She was lying along the edge of the bed, at such a distance that she would fall if she stirred. She couldn't close her eyes. The sheet ate at her, and her whole body was quivering. She had curled herself up so much that she looked like a little ball. She would roll down to the far end of the room if you flicked her. Her daughter-in-law was tolerant for 3 or 4 nights, but then she calmly informed her husband that it was inappropriate to carry on like that. Although a calm and reasonable man, Masood D suddenly blew a gasket for no apparent reason. He shouted and everyone heard his shouting. The kids panicked and the husband and wife criticized each other, saying things they had never said. Mahin Banu died and came alive again. She damned herself for having come there and disturbed the life of a family, and on the same day she decided to leave. She packed her suitcase and put on her shoes and jacket. She sat on the chair in the corridor and waited for her heartbeat to subside, and for her thoughts to come to order so that she could see where she could go. She would go back to Tehran. That was the best thing to do. She would go to her sister's house. Back to Dr. Yunus Khan and his weirdo acts. No, impossible, she would go to her cousin's house. She had forgotten that the cousin had died a couple of months ago, however, and now she was crying for her. She would go to her male cousins and nephews. The nephews had moved to America. She would go to the graveyard, to hell, beg, become a housemaid, whatever. At least she would be in her own country. She could lie down and die. One thing was clear, she wouldn't stay here. Fortunately, her daughter Manijay, who was called Maggie abroad, called from London and insisted that her mother board a plane and fly to her that very day, that very moment. It was of course not possible at that exact moment, but they took her to the airport the following week. Like a bird released from its cage, Mahin Banu found a new soul. The plane was like a house, warm and protected. She had her seat. It would have sufficed for her if she had also been given a seat on Earth, a tiny place she would know was her own. She ate her meal with eagerness, and she remembered Nane Khanum bringing the dinner tray for her. In those days she was someone, she had authority, and how she felt pity and how she cried when she heard that Nane Khanum's grandson had been martyred in the war. Her son had been taken to the lunatic asylum. Everything would have been different if this had not happened. Masood D had planned to rent a small place for his mother and trust her with Nane Khanum. That would be the best solution for everyone, for himself and her mother. But who had ever seen the future? A mortar shell chopped off the head of Nane Khanum's grandson, doing him in right away. A few people came from Sabzeva and havoc ensued. People came from the Revolutionary Committee, from the Martyrs Foundation, with congratulations and consolations. Nane Khanum was taken back to her village and given a room and a monthly pension. And she was set to stay there. All this had happened before Mahin Banu went to her sister's house. Maggie, formerly Manijay, hugged her mother and pressed her with such love and longing that Mahin Banu sighed, a sigh of pain and happiness. Her son-in-law also kissed her and squeezed her hand hard. David Oakley was a lovely man with Jewish blood, so he was warm-hearted. Mahin Banu was not happy with her daughter marrying a Jewish Englishman. She had wished to have a Muslim, Iranian son-in-law. She hadn't said anything, she didn't interfere with the children's affairs. But at the bottom of her heart, she had felt sad until the day she saw the healthy face and wide, sincere eyes of David Oakley, and a heavy load was lifted off her chest. She held his manly arm, laughed, and she only just then realized how frail and tiny she was. Her head stood lower than her son-in-law's waistline. She was like a chicken, no more than 40 kilos, maybe less, with hollow bones and legs as narrow as pencils. It was raining and cold. David Oakley had a car. He put the suitcases in the boot and cheerfully patted Mahin Banu's delicate shoulder. Maggie sat beside her mother and rested her head on her painful shoulder. She whispered in her ear that she would never let her go back to Paris or Tehran, and Mahin Banu's heart melted at all that kindness. She closed her eyes and fell asleep, but she didn't dream. Maggie and David Oakley's flat had no elevator on the 4th floor. Tired and dizzy, Mahin Banu was staggering. David Oakley lifted his mother-in-law, who was as light as a feather, and Mahin Banu screamed, became erect and stiff like a pencil, and remained that way. Maggie laughed. David Oakley was in a good mood. He held his mother-in-law like a wooden doll under his arm and walked up the stairs. Mahin Banu didn't move an eyelash. She couldn't believe it. She didn't know whether to laugh, scream or cry. Such a thing had never happened. She didn't have a natural reaction or a ready response to accept or reject the situation. She thought she wasn't herself. She felt that she had turned into an object, a broom or a chair bought from the market, and being a broom was a fresh experience with its particular world. Maggie's flat was smaller than her brother's. It didn't have more than one bedroom. They had no kids. Still, they had a dog, fluffy and significant, as big as Mahin Banu. David Oakley was reasonable and logical, with reasons and principles for his actions. He wasn't emotional, he used his brain. He couldn't afford to beat around the bush. It was agreed that Mahin Banu would sleep on the sofa in the living room. And when the couple had guests, she would lie in their bed, asleep or awake, and keep waiting. It wasn't a favorable solution, but what else could be done? Mahin Banu had no complaints whatsoever, and even if she did, she knew it wasn't the right time to utter it. This made life easier for everybody. David Oakley was a teacher. He taught economics, and he carefully wrote down all the expenses of the house. Fortunately, Mahin Banu was no bigger than a chicken, and she tried to eat less than a household hen. Maggie went to the university. She studied accounting. The couple left in the morning and returned in the evening, exhausted. They were hardly in the mood to speak. If they did speak, it was about high prices and the cost of living. Mahin Banu had no savings of her own. On the very first day, with much insistence and begging, she forced her daughter to sell her ruby ring and earrings. Maggie had said, "No, impossible." Her husband had said, "Nothing wrong with it." And Maggie had cried. First she said no, but reluctantly accepted her husband's recommendation. Mahin Banu had learned to talk to herself. She didn't understand her son-in-law's language, and Maggie had to speak with her husband in English or not speak at all. They ate their dinner in silence. Maggie reviewed her lessons, and David Oakley read the newspaper, all the pages front and back. All three sat down and watched television, scientific and cultural programs, chat shows and debates. Mahin Banu stared and gazed without seeing or understanding anything. She was immersed in her memories of another place and time. During the days, she was alone. She cleaned the house and put it in order. She tampered with the 2 flower pots on the windowsill and watched the endless rain and the city's dull sky for hours. She was scared of David Oakley's dog, and most of the time she stayed in bed until her daughter returned. Sometimes she went out if the weather allowed. She sat down on a bench in the park facing the block and shivered. It was a hard winter, and she finally caught a cold. First her throat swelled and then her chest got infected. What coughing! It was as if she would cough out her entrails. Worse than all was her coughing, which prevented the next-door neighbor from sleeping. He banged his fist on the wall, and Mahin Banu hid her head under the pillow. She shoved the corner of the sheet into her mouth and held her breath. Everything changed once spring came. A few light rays appeared behind the clouds, opening the hearts. David Oakley took 3 days off and took her wife and mother-in-law for sightseeing and recreation. All of them enjoyed it immensely. Maggie bought medications and pills and syrups for her mother, and Mahin Banu even put on some 2 kilos of weight and thanked God from the bottom of her heart. But she had hardly finished thanking when the tide turned again. It was early summer. David Oakley used to spend 2 months of summer with his aunt in the mountains. It was impossible to take Mahin Banu there. During those 2 months they rented out the house to help with the expenses. It was understandable, mainly since the mother-in-law had brought extra expenses with her and needed some additional income. They decided to send Mahin Banu to Paris to see her son. They made the decision abruptly. Without speaking to Masood D, they put Mahin Banu on the plane and informed Masood D that his mother was on her way. It was the wrong time, and although glad to see his mother, Masood D couldn't keep her at that particular time. She would have been welcome any other time except for that time, she must understand. He said that it was impossible. It was summertime, and the whole family was visiting the south of France. They didn't have the money to stay in a hotel or rent a seaside bungalow, so they had to stay in a tent. They would sleep by the stream in the desert. Well, not in the desert, the woods or the plain. What was the difference? It was simply impossible to take Mahin Banu with them. The sister and brother argued. David Oakley had several solutions. They brainstormed, and it was finally agreed to return Mahin Banu to London and make arrangements so that she would stay there. Although they tried to whisper in whispers, Mahin Banu could hear their talks and arguments. She pressed the tip of her toes to the ground, hoping a hole would open and swallow her. She saw she was being passed around like a useless object. Her head was reeling. Firuza Khanum was one of Maggie's friends. She had a small laundry which provided her with a means of living. They asked for her help. Firuza Khanum was good-humored and witty. She said she lived in a tiny room with no room for a guest. However, behind the laundry there was a vacant storage room. It didn't have any windows but was warm and protected. David Oakley agreed. Maggie was unhappy, but she didn't have much of a choice, so she kept quiet. Mahin Banu agreed too. She wanted the whole business to close quickly. The room behind the laundry was damp and dark, and the first night Mahin Banu cried till morning and asked God to help her die. She asked herself what had attached her so much to life and where her strength came from. And she saw that it was all because of her love for her kids, and she vowed to God to take that love out of her heart so that she would be relieved. Firuza Khanum was a nice woman. She was a match for 10 men. She had a husband who lived in Tehran, one of those sad, opium addict husbands. Once a year at his wife's expense he went abroad, moaned and groaned, complained hither and yon, a depressed hollow good-for-nothing man. He had been respectable in the old days, or so he thought. Educated, into books and translation. He had been devastated with the first blow, disturbed and disappointed. Firuza Khanum was a lion of a woman. She couldn't stand howls and moans and groans. She had sent her kids to England. She had gone to London herself and started a business. She was also manly and helpful. She helped those around her if they deserved it. As soon as she set her eyes on Mahin Banu, the sweet face, the sad amber-colored eyes, she was fascinated by her. She did her shopping for herself. She had her sit by the machines in the laundry, brought her Persian books and newspapers to read, and kept her busy. Karim Khan, Mahin Banu's brother, lived in Canada. He had money, a house, and a garden with birds and rabbits. He heard through word of mouth about the jarring state of his sister, and he blew his top. He was so offended that he wrote to his niece and nephew and insulted and humiliated them. Maybe he went too far, but he couldn't help it. He ordered them to arrange for his sister's move. He had an acquaintance in the Canadian embassy who helped him obtain a visa for Mahin Banu. He sent her the air ticket, and when Masood D or Maggie tried to interfere, he phoned them and yelled at both. And since he was the senior member of the family, they both backed off. It was at the beginning of winter when Mahin Banu departed for Canada. She was glad she was again between heaven and earth. This was the longest route. What a joy. She sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the transparent light outside. Her seat was soft and warm, and that was what she wanted, a corner immune from other people's aggression. She had a fever, and the sunshine behind the window greatly pleased her. One moment she would fall asleep, her head dropped onto her chest, and then she would come to again. Her eyelids opened halfway and her glance traveled to the end of the horizon, to the end of that vast expanse, and expanded till eternity. Beneath her feet was a plain of white clouds, bright, light, immaculate, like a providential dream, the dream of the elect, carefree angels. Someone said something into her ear. It was the passenger sitting next to her. She didn't hear it. She declined the food tray and turned her head away. She pressed her face against the window pane and inhaled the sunlight with fascinated eyes. She felt 1,000 tiny stars twinkle between her thoughts, and a lamp was lit inside her. The blue sky was a monolith, without a speck of cloud, without an irrelevant impulse or inappropriate undulation, reaching as far as the last frontier of imagination, as far as the origin of things, beyond commonplace forms and current scales. Mahin Banu saw herself at 12 playing in the garden in Damavand. It was snowing, and her fingertips were numb from the touch of those hollow frozen feathers. She was watching the mind-boggling falling of snow, looking at the grey end of the horizon, and she felt as though her feet had lifted off the ground and she was flying towards the sky. She loved this game. She didn't forget it even when she grew old. She would sit by the window, and Nane Khanum would bring her tea and beat. They both kept staring like jinn-haunted people at the monotonous whiteness of the outside and very slowly drifted into sleep. She would wake up in the middle of the night. She knew that the snow was still falling, and she listened. The whole city was sleeping, frozen beneath a white cover, like a house with nobody in it, with its furniture hidden under clean sheets. No sound could be heard except the magical silence of the atmosphere, overflowing with nothingness, with the silent presence of God. All through the journey in fever and drenched in sweat but joyful, she was sitting by the window, and she was so intoxicated and fascinated by what was outside that she couldn't remember where she was or who she was. She was drowsing. She was dreaming. She kept coming back to herself. She looked. She remembered her memories and drifted again. She was spinning. She was in the snow. In the center of the sky. She was sliding. She was everywhere in different times. In a single moment she could see thousands of images of herself scattered in space, or a column of different Mahin Banus, some old, some as a child and young, in this life and other epochs. A woman raised to the power of infinity, women tied to each other in a chain of eternal return. It was the first time she wasn't thinking of her children or people on earth, of the large Tabriz carpet or Kashmir, her house in Pahlavi Avenue, or her earthly memories. She was above the clouds, and the vast expanse was slowly entering her body and settling down at the bottom of her soul, like the pleasant warmth of autumn, moist and stagnant. It made a cocoon, weaving a web around her and spreading an umbrella. It was as though she was in the womb of the cosmos, protected and immune beyond time. Karim Khan was impatiently awaiting her sister's arrival. He had decided to keep her to himself, and he was embarrassed at the carelessness of his niece and nephew. He burst out crying when he set eyes on Mahin Banu. He too was full of grief and torn apart from his relations. He longed to return to his homeland 1,000 times a day and then discouraged himself. Seeing her sister old, broken and vagrant, renewed his grief. He told himself to hell with exile, and it crossed his mind for a moment to go back. He had a garden and real estate. He would return to his home and life and live with Mahin Banu. They were close to each other, they had grown up together, and their age gap was insignificant. He was shocked to see Mahin Banu. How thin and pale and confused she was. She kept looking, but she didn't see anything. Her mind was in disarray. He was shocked when he held her hand. It was just a piece of hot bone. He spoke to her, she didn't hear or understand. She gave nonsensical answers. Agitated and devastated, he hugged his sister and kissed her all over the face. He felt his old age and a pain wrung his heart. When they reached home, he put Mahin Banu to rest in a large bed and called a doctor. He telephoned her children and told them about their mother's state. He explained that it was all about the fatigue from traveling, sleeplessness and high blood pressure, that it wasn't anything serious, that there was no reason to worry, and that he took to looking after his sister. He was excited and overwhelmed with joy, and he had so much to say that he didn't know where to begin. He spoke of the past childhood days, yesterday and the day before, of himself and his sudden decision to return to his homeland. He was laughing, he was joyous. He couldn't believe he had decided to return, and owed his sudden happiness to his sister. He couldn't understand how the thought had struck his mind. Maybe he had been shocked by the sight of his sister's dazed face and her wandering presence. He looked at Mahin Banu's staring eyes, which seemed devoid of any familiar memories and reasonable thoughts, and he was scared. He could see the meaning of exile in her, and it shook his heart to the very bottom. He had just realized how lonely and isolated he was, that there was nothing beneath his feet, and that he had just a transient and temporary presence, like an alien traveler in a cold and sad railway station. He held Mahin Banu's hand and kissed it. He told her that her vagrancy and homelessness had come to an end, that they would return as soon as she recovered, and Mahin Banu closed her eyes. She saw herself sitting by the aeroplane window and the blue expanse calling to her. She fell asleep and again dreamt of the sky flowing like a fluid sea towards the bright regions of being, and she couldn't know how many days or dozens of days she had been sleeping. She felt thirsty, she stood up, her legs were trembling. Karim Khan wasn't home. She looked around. She couldn't remember where she was. A soft light was pouring in through the lace curtain of the window. She went forward. She put her hand on the back of the chair. She paused to take a breath. She took a few steps and felt like she had moved mountains. Sweat ran down her face. With a trembling hand, she pulled the curtain to one side. It was snowing. She listened, the same old inviting silence. Nane Khanum had brought her tea and nabat. She was standing by the door, crying. Her grandson had been martyred. She was leaving for Sabzeva. She said, "Wait, Nane Khanum, I want to give you some money for the trip," and put her hand on the door handle. She was tired, she wished to sit down. She was looking for her seat. The air hostess was checking her ticket. A gust of cold wind hit her face. She shivered. It was snowing, the snowflakes were heavy as large as saucers. She stepped forward. Her foot slipped. It was a cold aeroplane. She couldn't find her seat. She stepped further forward. A cold road stretched ahead of her. The snow went into her eyes. Mount Damavand, towering, unwavering and glorious, was looking at her from far off. It was as magnificent as her father when he stood to pray, and the wind blew under his cloak, and it seemed to her that his head touched the sky and his feet were rooted in the ground. How nice it was when she lived near this mountain that scraped the sky, this mysterious excellent height, this man standing between two marble columns of the terrace at noon, with his shadow stretched to the end of the world. How joyful it was when she crawled underneath his cloak and climbed over his back, over the highest peak in the world, beyond the earth, the tiny clay houses and the men the size of ants, feeble and meager. She could see the same picture when she looked out of the aeroplane window, and it seemed to her as if she was again riding on her father's shoulders. Nobody could reach her, neither her mother who reprimanded and blamed her, nor the bad-tempered arithmetic teacher who told of eternal multiplications and divisions, neither the policeman down the alley who twisted her ear, nor her husband who restricted and bullied her, neither her kids who were hanging on her, devouring her flesh and blood with an animal pleasure, nor others who set moral criteria and historical philosophies for her, and filled her skull with the crushing weight of words, and estimated the borders of her sight and limits of her intelligence with their short geometrical rulers and miserable mathematical scales. Someone was calling to her, maybe it was beyond Mount Damavand. She ran, turned around, turned into a street on her left filled with snow, felt hot and burning, took off her jacket, undid the buttons of her dress and turned her face to the sky. She remembered the childhood game and laughed. The snow went into her mouth. It was delicious. She looked. She kept staring without blinking, her feet lifted off the ground, snowflakes were transfixed in the middle of the air, and she was ascending. She was in the sky over the clouds. She saw Mount Damavand. It was down under her feet, and on its peak was placed a large comfortable armchair of walnut wood and red velvet, the same chair that used to be in her father's study. The air hostess guided her to her seat, her exclusive seat. She sat down. She was the size of a little kid and lost in the chair. She wrapped her father's cloak around her and pressed her face against the window pane. The sky was a monolithic blue, limpid like a spring of light. And the vast, generous and magnanimous expanse was looking at her. She listened. There were no sounds but the silence of the falling snow and the sweet quiet of death. Masood D blamed his sister and considered her guilty. His sister complained about Uncle Kareem. David Oakley said that such events happened all the time, and since he taught at the university, he spoke of the law of cause and effect and the rules of history and economy. Fawaz Khanum grieved and then forgot. Others also forced themselves not to forget Mahin Banu's story, but they did. With all those problems, misery, work and fatigue amid war and exile, how could one retain one's memory? And this Mahin Banu understood well. Thank God she was an intelligent woman.